Number 10. Flow Free. Line Rider, why did you put mobile games on this list? Those aren't real video games. Say what you will, but the flow-free games are fantastic for what they are. You get thousands of puzzles for free, and if you want more puzzles, it's less than $5 for each of the 4 games to unlock every level pack that's currently locked, as well as all future locked level packs. I played these games daily for over a year, which is a great deal for that price. Anyway, the game itself is the epitome of simple but amazing, as everything is made crystal clear but still extremely engaging. The gameplay is very consistent, with the same basic premise throughout all the games, with slight touches here and there to make for more interesting and intriguing puzzles. The graphics are so intuitive, eye-catching, and effective, looking amazing while not being distracting. And the sound design is also very simple, but quite fitting for the situation. In fact, the game doesn't have any music, which is why you're hearing this music instead. It does occasionally crash when trying to load the level select without first connecting to the internet and pressing more games, but that's not a big deal for a game like this. Warps is also much harder than the developers were anticipating, which is fine for the main levels, but can make the daily challenge a chore rather than a quick brain teaser. But aside from those qualms, this series of games is fantastic. As crazy as it may sound, I actually did a major project for my high school based off this series of games, looking at how a systematic algorithm would handle solving a given puzzle. Without these games, I probably would have had a worse time finding a topic for that project, so I had to give these games a top 10 position for that alone. Number 9. Animal Crossing: New Leaf. Normally, I like video games that constantly excite me with new things happening and tons of choices, but sometimes video games can be quite fun even when they're slow-paced, and Animal Crossing is the epitome of these. Who would have ever thought that living a second life could turn into a relaxing experience? Well, Nintendo certainly knew what they were doing here, as you don't really have to do much at all. Once you're done completing your mayoral obligations, you can do pretty much whatever suits your fancy. You can find the daily fossils, money rock, and fake rock. You can help expand and open stores, participate in the game's fake holidays, or raise money for a new public works project. You can spruce up your house, talk to your neighbors, go shopping, or get your hair done. With the new update, you can visit a campsite, obtain more exclusive items, reorganize rooms and store items more efficiently than ever, and even invite Nintendo characters to live in your town. But at the end of the day, what this game succeeds the most at is opening its arms and letting your worries wash away. Just look up at the sky, the stars will listen to you. Or you could make tons of money by setting the Bell Boom Ordinance, going to the island at night and catching all the expensive beetles. That works too. Number 8. WarioWare DIY. Other WarioWare games are fun, but at times it feels like they're just throwing together random game ideas. You'd think a big game studio would be able to think of a full game on their own, right? Well, they seem to understand this, and for this overlooked installation of the series, they instead allowed the players to add their own random game ideas into the mix. The game-making engine isn't that complicated on the outside, but it can actually do a lot more than you might expect, as the developers have shown in their games. But what if convoluted switch and dummy logic escapes you? Well, you can learn and take inspiration from the game itself, which allows the player to view how any of the microgames were made. Not to mention that the tutorials for making games feature Penny and Wario making corny jokes, bickering like an old couple, and still introducing the game-making engine quite well. There's even a game-making dojo that comfortably introduces the harder bits of logic that can be made. The art and music editors are equally user-friendly and even have their own makers, which admittedly aren't as good, but they still exist. And all of this might make you forget about the already great microgames that come with the game and the amazing cartoony art direction. While there are better make-your-own games later on this list, this one is so quirky and unique, and I spent so much time on it that I had to put it up here. And sadly, I made more microgames about math than I'm willing to admit. Number 7. Portal 2. I'm normally not a fan of shooter games, but that's mainly because they focus too much on violence. But a first-person shooter that's about puzzles instead? Sign me up. This game takes what its prequel did and expands on it in all the right ways. You still have your 2 portals that can transport you or any object with all its momentum between them. You still have ingenious puzzles that take this simple mechanic as far as it can go, but you now have a more engaging story than simply escape from the test course that contains more quirky characters, plot twists, and environments than the original. You now have more test elements like lasers and laser redirect cubes, edgeless safety cubes, light bridges, excursion funnels, and 3 different types of gel. You now have a 2-player mode, which doesn't have much for a story besides save the humans, but has arguably even more creative puzzles, cutting out the fat to focus on them. If you're on PC, which comes free if you buy the console version, you now have a test editor, which albeit isn't amazing but gets the job done well enough, and you can share your finished puzzles with the world. You can even get the Hammer map editor on the side, a program used by the game designers themselves to make the story mode, and you can play other tests made with the Hammer editor even if you don't have it. I do wish Valve would make more test courses as DLC, but I guess 7 years after the game's release is probably too late to start that. Regardless, this game is amazing for what it is, and it's not that expensive on Steam, so you guys should try it. Spoiler alert, Wheatley is an idiot. Number 6. Super Mario Odyssey. I told you a 3D Mario adventure would be on the list somewhere, and you probably expected this game to be it. This game takes what every other 3D Mario game did before it, refined it to its basics, and then expanded it to a fantastic single-player adventure. Controlling Mario is far smoother than it has ever been, with tons of movement options that allow for all different types of cool tricks. I'm glad they made Cappy not just a gimmick for controlling other characters and objects. That may be neat, but Cappy really improves the game by allowing for air stalling and many different types of bouncing, making this game the best controlling platformer I've played in a long time. On top of this, the visual presentation is absolutely stunning, with top-notch graphics and tons of visual effects that are glorious to behold. And the kingdoms are quite varied, each having tons of unique things about them, which makes the game constantly exciting to play, even if you're replaying it. The big reason this game isn't higher on my list is that once you get to know the game, it actually isn't as big and expansive of an adventure as you might have hoped. I was able to 100% the game in about a month of sporadic play with minimal use of walkthroughs on my first try, leaving something to be desired. And none of the new features really entice me either, so there would have to be a new kingdom as DLC for me to return to the game. However, the 50+ hours I played of it were absolutely fantastic, which puts it at number 6. The other games from the 3D Mario franchise I considered were Super Mario 64 and Super Mario Sunshine, both of which are much smaller, buggier, and less smooth to play than Odyssey. Number 5. Planet Coaster. And here's one of the better make-your-own games I was mentioning earlier. Planet Coaster is the spiritual successor to the Roller Coaster Tycoon series, at least the first 3 games, made by Frontier, the same developer as Roller Coaster Tycoon 3. Remember how that game took a brave step with the franchise by going full 3D, but everything was still limited to a grid and pre-made track pieces? Well, they went even further and eliminated almost all restrictions in Planet Coaster. As for the most part, you can build everything however you want. The most obvious change is the coaster designer. Rather than choosing one of several predetermined directions, elevations, and bankings like you had to do in the previous games, you can now very closely modify every individual track piece's length, direction, elevation, and banking to whatever you want. There's also a smoothing button that helps tremendously to make sure tracks aren't too fearful or nauseating, which should be used often. The test results are also improved. Not only can you see the optimal values for each result and where your coaster stands in comparison, but you can see a heat map of your coaster for most of these results, indicating the exact places that cause that value to change. Of course, the rest of the theme park editor is great too, with tons of scenery options, many larger pre-made options, and even coaster triggers. You can make your park as simple or as complicated as you want. The one aspect that is still limited to a grid is making buildings. However, that is arguably better with a grid, and each building can have its own grid, so it's not very limiting at all. I could never put as much time and money into the game as the people on YouTube YouTube do, but the fact that this game has all the tools to make those kinds of parks blows my mind. This game does have its flaws though. The path creator is still quite limited, the wait time settings for roller coasters can be inconsistent, especially in test mode, the saving options still appear to be quite primitive, and the game takes tons of RAM even on the lowest graphics settings. But I can mostly overlook these flaws while I'm making my unrestricted theme park, which is the thing I've wanted to do since I got addicted to theme parks by going to so many in real life. I don't even care about most of the modes, to be honest. The sandbox mode on its own is enough for the game to make it this high on the list. Number 4. The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. What can I say about this game that hasn't already been said millions of times before? The controls are really tight, using every input in a natural way that flows really well. Pro tip, don't use the Wii U gamepad, it's too big for the controls to feel good. Anyway, the combat system, while unusual for a Zelda game, still works quite well, with tons of different weapons, shields, and armor that all have their quirks to do specific things well. And the D-pad or directional buttons feel very natural to use as on-the-fly weapon changing. The story is a masterful expansion of the typical 3D Zelda story, with the world developing over the gap in time between games, including more villages and characters. The shrines are a breath of fresh air from the traditional Zelda dungeons, leaving exploration in the overworld for the most part to focus mainly on puzzle solving and combat practice, which I appreciate. But don't think they forgot about the classic Zelda dungeon feel, as the Divine Beast encounters will feel very similar to a true Zelda dungeon, including bosses and more enemies, as well as making the puzzles more elaborate and large scale. And last but most obvious, the overworld itself is truly stunning in its sheer size, with every area having something to offer, giving the game a lot of replay value after you eventually beat it in the first place. Even the music and the ambience always fit the mood perfectly and immerse you even more, which other Zelda games don't do nearly as well. Overall, this is easily Nintendo's most ambitious launch title, and man did they deliver on their promises. I've easily put over 160 hours into Breath of the Wild just completing the story, finding all the shrines, and finishing the side quests I started along the way. However, 160 hours still pales in comparison to the immense amount of time I've spent on the remaining games on my list, which is the main reason why this game doesn't break into the top 3. The other games from the Legend of Zelda franchise I considered are Wind Waker, specifically the HD remake, and A Link Between Worlds. Neither of those games are nearly as expansive as Breath of the Wild, of course.